The sound of squealing tires echoed in the dimly lit street as a black SUV rolled to a sudden stop. Officer Gerald White, his hand gripping the door handle, was the first to exit his patrol car. The air was thick with tension as he approached the vehicle with a firm, unwavering stride. He had seen it all, the routine traffic stops, the late-night drunks, the desperate criminals. But tonight, something felt off. In the driver's seat of the SUV sat a man in a tailored suit, his expression calm but sharp, the kind of presence that commanded attention. Officer White noticed his hands were gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white, but there was no sign of aggression. Just, quiet restraint. "License and registration," Officer White barked, his voice flat. The man slowly turned his head, looking up through the rearview mirror with a gaze that seemed to pierce the officer. He had seen this look before, too many times. Black men who exuded confidence in the face of an officer's power often made White uncomfortable. And there was something about this man, the fine-cut suit, the clean-shaven face, the deliberate and measured movements, that made him seem different. "I don't have time for this, officer," the man said, his voice deep and calm. He didn't raise it, but there was an undeniable sense of authority behind it. "I wasn't asking," White snapped, stepping closer. He could feel the rush of adrenaline starting to course through his veins. Something about the man's calm demeanor was unsettling. It was like the man was trying to hold on to something important. "Step out of the vehicle, now." The man didn't immediately comply. Instead, he glanced over at his passenger seat where a briefcase sat. The flickering neon lights of a nearby convenience store illuminated the dark streets, casting fleeting shadows across the car's interior. His hand moved slowly toward the briefcase, but before he could open it, Officer White grabbed the door handle. "I said, step out," White repeated, his tone now laced with irritation. There was a slight pause before the man slowly exited the vehicle. He stood tall, almost too tall, as if daring White to challenge him. His demeanor was ice-cold, and in the dim light, the officer could just make out the faintest hint of a smirk. "Are you really going to do this?" the man asked quietly, his words almost a challenge. White's eyes narrowed as he scanned the man up and down. Something didn't sit right with him. This wasn't just any black man. There was something about his presence that made him feel small. Unseen. But he couldn't quite place it. "Put your hands on the car," White commanded, a little louder now. "Spread your legs." The man complied without a word, his hands flat against the car. White pulled out his cuffs, stepping toward him to secure his wrists. The tension between them thickened. The night air was biting, colder than it should have been for a spring evening. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. As Officer White secured the cuffs, his eyes darted to the man's face once more. There was something about him. Something more than just an ordinary suspect. He looked familiar. No, it wasn't just familiarity, it was recognition. A flicker of a thought brushed against White's mind, but he pushed it aside. He was too focused on the task at hand. "Do you know who I am?" the man asked, his voice still unwavering. White hesitated for a fraction of a second. He had been trained to never give suspects the benefit of the doubt, but this one. There was something about him that rattled his certainty. "I don't care," White said curtly. "You're being arrested. Resisting arrest, resisting authority. You'll get your chance to talk in front of a judge." White shoved the man roughly into the back of his patrol car, slamming the door shut with a force that echoed down the empty street. As he walked back to his own vehicle, White's hand trembled ever so slightly. There was something gnawing at him. A feeling, deep in his gut, that he had made a mistake. Moments later, the patrol car's radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Officer White, we just received a report on the suspect's identity," the dispatcher said. "We need you to verify. The man you've detained is Michael Richardson, CEO of Richardson Enterprises." White froze mid-step. The name hit him like a punch in the gut. He recognized it instantly. Michael Richardson. The CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the country. His net worth? In the billions. A man whose face was often plastered on the cover of business magazines. A philanthropist. A visionary. The kind of man who moved markets with a single tweet. His pulse quickened as he rushed back to the patrol car, his fingers fumbling as he unlocked the door. The man, Michael Richardson, sat in the back seat, staring out the window. "I told you," Richardson said, his voice calm but laced with an edge. "But you didn't want to listen." White stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. The truth hit him harder than he could have imagined. The man he had just arrested, who he had assumed was just another black man on the street, someone he could push around, intimidate, was the head of one of the most powerful companies in the world. There was a sharp, uncomfortable silence between them. White swallowed hard, his hand hovering over the door handle. He had made a grave mistake. A mistake born not out of ignorance, but out of the same racial biases that clouded his judgment every day. He had assumed, just like so many others, that because the man was black, he was just another criminal. "I didn't know," White muttered, the weight of the realization crushing him. He had been too blinded by his own assumptions, too trapped in his own prejudice to see the truth. Richardson let out a breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That's the problem, officer. You didn't know. And you never bothered to ask." White opened the door and released him, the shame of what he had just done weighing heavily on his chest. The CEO stepped out of the car, adjusting his suit jacket with the kind of dignity White hadn't expected to see from someone he had just manhandled. "You have no idea how many times this happens to people like me," Richardson said, his voice low but steady. "How many times we're reduced to a stereotype because of the color of our skin. And it's not just the small stuff. It's the big things too. The stuff that really matters." White watched him for a moment, his mind spinning, but no words came. He couldn't undo what he had done. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to make things right. As Richardson turned and walked away, White felt a deep ache in his chest. The kind of ache that comes from realizing how far you've strayed from the person you thought you were. He had just been taught a lesson he would never forget. But in the back of his mind, he knew this was just the beginning of his journey to understanding the truth, and to finally confronting the biases that had shaped his entire career. As the man disappeared into the night, White stood still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the empty street ahead. Officer White stood still, the hum of the city around him almost muted as his thoughts raced. It wasn't just the fact that he had made a mistake. It was the realization of how many times he had probably made the same mistake with countless other people. How many others had he dismissed, overlooked, or treated unjustly simply because of their appearance? The weight of that thought pressed down on him, making his legs feel heavy, like they were sinking into the asphalt. The night felt colder than before. The once clear sky now seemed heavy with the burden of truth. White's grip on the patrol car door tightened. He wanted to move, to do something to make the situation right, but for a moment, he was frozen, caught in the aftermath of his actions. He glanced over at the empty seat next to him. His partner, Officer Daniels, had been watching the entire exchange from the passenger side. Daniels wasn't just a colleague, he was a friend, someone White had known for years. But even Daniels' presence felt distant now, as though the gravity of what had just happened created a chasm between them that couldn't easily be crossed. Daniels was silent at first, and then, in a tone that was quiet but resolute, he spoke. "You know, it happens more often than we like to admit. The assumption. The profiling." White turned to him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I thought I knew better. But it felt different this time. I was so sure I was in the right, but..." Daniels cut him off with a sigh. "It's not about being right. It's about unlearning what we've been taught. And doing better. It's hard, man. But the hardest thing is facing it. That's where we start. White nodded slowly, but the weight of Daniel's words hit him with the force of a revelation. There was no easy fix for this. It wasn't just about this one arrest, this one moment of wrongdoing. It was about everything that had come before it. Everything that had built the biases he carried without even realizing it. The training, the culture, the assumptions that had been ingrained in him over the years, those were the real culprits. Do you think he'll make a complaint? White asked, though part of him already knew the answer. It was almost irrelevant. The mistake had been made, and nothing could erase it now. He's Michael Richardson, Daniels replied. He's got the resources to do whatever he wants. But I think it's bigger than that. I think he'll make sure this is seen. For the right reasons. And I think that's something we should pay attention to. White didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned against the door of the car, staring out into the night. A deep, gnawing feeling was settling in his chest. It wasn't just guilt. It was something else, a determination to understand. To change. The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts, and he turned his head to see Richardson walking back down the street, his posture unwavering. He was no longer handcuffed. He had been given his freedom, but there was something different about the way he walked now. It was as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, and yet he still moved with a sense of purpose. A quiet strength that White couldn't quite place. Richardson stopped a few feet from the patrol car and turned to look at Officer White one last time. There was no anger in his eyes, just a kind of quiet understanding. You'll figure it out, Richardson said, his voice steady. But it'll take time. And it starts with people like you. The ones who can admit they were wrong. That's where the real change begins. With that, Richardson turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkened street. White stood there for a long while, his mind processing the weight of what had just been said. There was no quick solution, no neat resolution to fix everything that had gone wrong. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to start anew. The next few days felt like a blur for Officer White. He spent hours going over the events in his mind, questioning his own actions, the choices he had made, and the deep-seated prejudices that had influenced those choices. He read about Michael Richardson, the billionaire CEO, philanthropist, and leader of an international tech company. But more importantly, he read about the impact Richardson had made, the lives he had changed, and the influence he had fought to wield for positive change in his community. White found himself looking at the world through a different lens, one that wasn't clouded by the easy stereotypes and biases that had colored his perception for so long. He began to see the faces in his community differently. He started to question his assumptions, not just about black men, but about everyone he encountered. How many times had he dismissed people based on the color of their skin? How many times had he been quick to assume that someone was guilty simply because of their appearance? The thought was uncomfortable. Unsettling. But it was the truth. And truth had a way of forcing change. As the days turned into weeks, White began to make small changes in his approach. He began to listen more, to ask questions before jumping to conclusions. He reached out to community leaders, activists, and even other officers who had been involved in similar incidents of racial profiling. He wanted to learn. He wanted to do better. But the most important step was the one that had already been set in motion. He had apologized to Michael Richardson, a genuine, heartfelt apology that came from a place of deep regret. Richardson had accepted it, but more importantly, he had made it clear that this wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about a system that needed to change. You're not alone in this, Richardson had told him. You've got the power to do something about it. But it's going to take work. Real work. And that's the hardest part. It was work that White was willing to commit to. No longer satisfied with the status quo, he knew that his journey toward redemption would be long. But for the first time in his life, he was ready to begin. Months later, White stood in front of a group of new recruits at the police academy. His speech was honest, raw, and unpolished. He shared his experience, the lessons he had learned, and the mistakes he had made. The room was silent as he spoke, and for the first time in his career, he saw something in their eyes, something that told him they were listening. That they understood. In that moment, White knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. There would still be challenges, mistakes, and setbacks. But he was no longer afraid of them. Because now, he was armed with the truth. And that, he realized, was the most powerful tool of all. As Officer White wrapped up his speech to the recruits, the room remained quiet, save for the soft shuffle of feet as they began to process what they had just heard. He could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of curiosity and caution. It was only natural, his past had been far from perfect, and his words now were a sharp contrast to the persona they may have expected from someone in his position. But in that silence, White knew something had shifted. One recruit, a young woman with short hair and an assertive presence, raised her hand. White gave her a nod, acknowledging her without a word. She cleared her throat, her voice steady but probing. "Officer White, how do you stay motivated when you know that so many before you failed to change? How do you keep going when it feels like the system is built to push people like us into the same cycle?" White paused for a moment, considering her question. It wasn't one that could be answered easily. He wasn't sure he had all the answers, and he wouldn't pretend to. But he had learned something crucial over the past few months: the fight wasn't about immediate victory. It was about the small, incremental changes that would build into something larger. It was about taking responsibility, even when it was hard, and doing the hard work of confronting his own biases. "I won't pretend it's easy," he began, his voice quieter than before. "I've seen what happens when we don't confront the truth. When we turn a blind eye to the systems that uphold racism, inequality, and injustice. And believe me, it's tempting to walk away. It's tempting to think nothing's going to change. But then, I remember what happened when I was confronted with my own mistakes. I thought I was untouchable. But I was wrong." He paused, letting his words settle in the room. "I realized that real change doesn't come from external forces. It comes from within. From people like us. And, most importantly, it comes from the courage to face those uncomfortable truths and do something about them." The room was still, but White could see a few heads nodding. The young woman who had asked the question seemed to be reflecting on his words, a look of understanding starting to form on her face. "We're not going to change everything overnight," White continued. "But we can change how we show up. We can change how we see people, how we treat them, and how we hold ourselves accountable. That's the first step. And it's the hardest one." Another recruit, a young man with a weary look in his eyes, raised his hand this time. His question was simple but heavy. "And what if we fail? What if we mess up?" White met his gaze. "Failure isn't the end. It's part of the process. What matters is how we respond to that failure. Are we willing to learn from it, or are we going to let it define us?" "I messed up. Big time. But I didn't let it stop me from trying to do better. And I won't let it stop you either." The recruits were listening now, all of them. White could feel their energy shift. The skepticism that often accompanied the start of any training session was being replaced with something else, something deeper, more introspective. Later that evening, as Officer White sat alone in his office, the weight of the day's conversation still hung heavy on his mind. He had spoken from his heart, but the work wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. He had taken the first steps toward creating change, but it was clear that he couldn't do it alone. He needed others to be willing to look inside themselves, to ask the tough questions, and to be willing to do the work, too. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his train of thought. He glanced at the screen and saw a number he didn't recognize. It was from a local area code, so he picked up, curiosity piqued. "Hello," he answered. "Officer White?" a voice on the other end asked. It was a woman's voice, calm but firm. "This is Officer White." "Who is this?" "My name is Carla Thompson. I'm the director of the Unity Initiative. I don't know if you're familiar with us, but we've been working on programs to bridge the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities. We've heard about your recent work. Your apology to Michael Richardson and your efforts to make changes within your department." White sat up straighter, immediately alert. "I'm familiar with the Unity Initiative. It's a good program. But I didn't think anyone would be paying attention to me." "We're always paying attention to those who are willing to change," Carla said. "And I'd like to talk with you. We're working on a new program, one that focuses on officer accountability, racial bias, and community engagement. I think you'd be a valuable part of this initiative. We need people who aren't afraid to confront the hard truths, who are willing to lead by example." White was silent for a moment, processing her words. The offer sounded too good to be true, but at the same time, it felt like the opportunity he had been waiting for. This could be the chance to make a real difference, on a larger scale. "I'm listening," he finally said. Carla's voice softened. "Let's set up a meeting. I believe we can do something together. Something that will change the system from the inside out." The following weeks were a whirlwind for Officer White. He met with Carla and other community leaders, discussing how law enforcement could truly serve the communities it was meant to protect. It wasn't just about making arrests, it was about building trust, forging relationships, and understanding the deep-rooted issues that caused friction between the police and marginalized communities. The Unity Initiative became a focal point in his efforts to transform not only his department but also his own mindset. It was a place where officers could come together to acknowledge their own biases, where they could hear from community members and truly understand their experiences, and where they could be held accountable for their actions, both in the field and outside of it. White was no longer the man who had made the snap judgment on Michael Richardson. He had learned from his failure, and now, he was committed to making sure that others didn't make the same mistakes. He became a leader within the department, one who spoke out about the importance of empathy, understanding, and continuous self-reflection. There were still difficult days. There were still moments of discomfort, when old habits tried to creep back into his thoughts. But White had learned that the path to true change was not paved with perfection. It was paved with humility, hard work, and a willingness to grow. Months turned into years, and Officer White's influence within the police force began to expand. The Unity Initiative grew, its reach extending to other cities and departments. White's story, his transformation from a man caught in his biases to someone committed to justice and reform, became a symbol of hope. And as he walked into work one morning, the familiar feeling of dread he once had when confronting his own mistakes had been replaced with something much more powerful: purpose. "Let's make today count," he thought, as he walked through the doors of the precinct, ready for whatever challenge lay ahead. Because, for the first time, he knew that he wasn't just doing the job. He was changing it. And in doing so, he was changing himself. As Officer White continued his work, the changes he had fought for began to take root. The community's trust in law enforcement grew, and officers within his department started to see the value in self-reflection and accountability. White's journey of growth, sparked by a single moment of failure, became a testament to the power of personal transformation and systemic change. He had learned that the fight for justice was ongoing, and true leadership meant always striving to do better. With each step, he was building a future where fairness, understanding, and empathy were no longer just ideals, but reality.